situations that you make are supposed to always put pressure on the Minotaur's silence, which really isn't very hard because the philosophy of silence basically is kind of undoable. I mean, you're gonna get screwed one way or the other by it. You might as well say, "All right, I'm running off to the jungle sooner or later." There's other weirdness to pull in that I consider to be a positive sort, which is that you are to be somewhat allegorical in your prep. These are fantastic versions of things that we may feel passionate about. If you overdo that, then the whole thing just becomes an exercise in symbology. But if you do it in a way that appeals to you, you get a really pretty rich fantasy coming out of it because you deliver it with some weight to the players. In my case, I had a situation. Um, the idea is that all the Minotaurs have these kind of menial jobs. Um, Even though their character class may be leader or soldier or philosopher or stuff like that. That's not what they do in human society. They're shoveling shit. So in this case, there was kind of a plaza by a river and a great big sort of civic sculpture, participatory sculpture was built there, and all these people had put all this investment in it, and it was this thing you painted it, and anyway, it was kind of it reminded me of a lot of the participatory and somewhat uh, monolithic city art that I observe in a lot of cities here in Europe. Very modernist stuff. The public gets to play with it. It's kind of quirky. It's some of them come and go. Others are there and stay a long time. Well, anyway, it's that kind of thing. And there was a dust up really about some fishermen down the river who really hated this and thought that the paints were poisoning their fish. Now, this all sounds real pedestrian, but you've got characters who the Minotaurs kind of depend on. They depend on them for their livelihoods, their relationships with them, and stuff like that. And they get caught in different characters' weird beliefs. They get caught in other characters' expectations. They get caught in the differing and somewhat contradictory demands of being silent. And so, violence, it's a fantastical situation. Violence is always lurking around the corner. And that things can get pretty violent. And the system itself is extremely big on maiming your Minotaur. Even if they don't die, which they won't, as long as you have a life token sitting next to you, they can get really torn up. And so you have a lot of soap opera with all these different NPCs. The Minotaurs may or may not know each other to begin with, and they often find themselves helping each other out, partly because the mechanics benefit greatly from helping out. So it's kind of like, my back's up against this wall, your back's up against that wall. Oh, look, we're back to back. Hey, nice to meet you. So that sort of thing happens. And what's kind of cool that I've noticed is that the jungle mechanic, um, I mean, you can go off to the jungle voluntarily, but if you go involuntarily by breaking silence fully and you don't have any silence tokens left, adventures in the jungle have their own rules. They're similar in some ways, but they have their own slightly different context. What I'm saying is that you can actually leave behind your scenarios that you were in. You aren't trapped in those circumstances. They tend to have sort of a chapter effect in the Minotaur's lives. So when we come back to them, we find them working some other job or scattered in different places, doing different things. They have been gaining name tokens, which is a huge deal. Name tokens coming up in the draw results are things that we all want. They're things like being able to help the people you want to help. Things like getting stuff done for good, resolving a problem for good, establishing something with extra benefits, basically having a big impact on things. You can't do it without a name, and the Minotaurs start nameless. Many of the results will start kicking in name tokens. At the end of a session, it's pretty much likely that one of the Minotaurs is going to get a name token through a particular mechanic. And So the characters gradually are building their names and their capabilities change. And so you end up with lots of these gifts that they're getting through strange means. Some of them are always like teetering on the edge of silence breakdown, and others have this big bank of silence. Kind of depends on their behavior as you go. So they have very different relationships to their emotions. Oop, there they are. There's the emotions. Um, they have different relationships to the culture and how they deal with it, and the city or the setting through these different adventures and these different scenarios has started to take on a pretty distinctive set of imagery and um, geography, even. So, I mean, I don't know much about the way that my river meandered through this particular area, but we know a lot about how it was set up with the plaza and the fishing place, and then the buildings further in, and the kind of society that you had around that area. We got that. So that district, its basic geography is known to us. Um, Kind of the thing where you feel like you would draw sort of little mini maps, and then sooner or later you're like, oh, well, this one is, like this relative to that one. Well, anyways, I find it an extremely engaging game. I don't have any problem with people, or I observe no problems with people picking it up, encountering it, and realizing, okay, I'm going to have to go into learning mode, and then being surprised that they've learned it. There isn't really much of a learning curve. It's all events and enough system management that you are engaged with the system and you know it has effects on you, but without basically playing it like checkers or something. So I had a great time. We had a fine violent situation. We had you know the almost obligatory troubled romance between a Minotaur and a human woman, which is kind of pretty pretty given in the game that there's going to be a fair amount of that. And did I mention that everybody's naked? The humans wear some clothes once in a while. The minotaurs will wear equipment, if they're fishing or they have a basket on their back or wearing a tool belt or something. But otherwise, they're great big honking male bull-headed dudes hanging out everywhere, and so it sort of makes for more interesting imagery. You're kind of like going, yeah, that looks different when we do it in this game than it would look in this other game. And you kind of get used to it after a bit, but you find yourself saying, wow, I guess this is sort of reason one why we're not making a movie of this. Well, anyways, I quite like it. I love my little tokens, and I love the way they work. It's a really intuitive system, and I kind of wish that other people would play it and that it would spawn some design conversations through the creation of other games that find a way to mess with this. It's not a flip system. You don't flip the tokens. They're not coins. You just draw them and look at them. Um, and it actually took me all the way back to a much older game produced by a friend of Paul's, whose name is not current at present, so I won't use it, but had the name back then. And so this game was called Weird. This game, which was very Nordic, had a rune or stone drawing technique from the bag, um, involving tragedy and triumph and stuff like that. And you lost your stones as you went. I mean, you knew your hero's story was, on its way out on purpose. Well, anyway, so I like to think that in some ways, the clay that woke at least glances back toward Weird and honors some of the ideas that came from there. I'd love to see that process, continue. It shouldn't stop here. I've seen plenty of games where you draw stuff from bags or bowls or whatever, but this particular approach seems very strong. One more thing, there was a game uh, also by Paul um, that he did when he was in, I think, high school, or just afterward. It's available online, so I'm not giving anything away. In a dimension syncopatic with ours, I believe it was called. and it is a young man's fantasy of much adventure and very heavily influenced by movies like Kroll and a few other things. Um, and one of its interesting features was a character race of lizard men who were real badasses and sort of warriors who wandered around doing mercenary and warrior things. And they wandered away from their hometowns because their mating rituals were so heinously agonizing and traumatic that the male lizards basically spent a lot of time away from home. And there's some reference to picking up human women as sort of buddies. And the clay that woke has a much more mature and developing context for the Minotaur's relationships with anybody, and particularly with human women. There's a great deal of depth to it that you can find. And so there, I'm not saying it's the same, but there is something, I was looking at Dimension Syncopatic with ours, and I was kind of going, there's just the tiniest touch of what might have been extracted and celebrated and brought to a more, um, you know, a deeper form. Well, anyway, my thoughts on the clay that woke a little bit anyway. You really ought to, find it if you can. It's very playable, and really, I mean, the adventures that come out of it are really colorful, and the minotaurs themselves become, through use, very, very distinctive characters. Again, in much the fashion of saying, I'm going to play a fighter, and then a few sessions in, you're going, that's not just a fighter. That's my dude. His name is this. This is what he's like. So, a lot of fun to do that stuff in a game that really rewards doing it and gives you tools to do it in the next round uh, with a great deal of consequence from what already happened. Anyways, that's that. I'll certainly be following up with more sessions with those players when we have the time and inclination. And I definitely have plenty of the inclination.